In the 6th year of Elizabeth I's reign, a young ambassador was summoned to the Queen's palace for what turned out to be an unexpectedly intimate encounter. The ambassador was led through a series of rooms. Each one took him closer to the heart of the palace and to the heart of the Queen.
First, he was led through the public rooms where the general court gathered. Then he passed through into the presence chamber, which was for select courtiers only. And then the Queen herself emerged and led our man, astonishingly, into her bedchamber. Once inside, they talked of politics for a while, and then she led him over to a little cabinet and opened it.
Inside the cabinet were some mysterious objects enclosed in paper.
Elizabeth picked out one of these objects. She carefully unwrapped it, and then she revealed to the ambassador one of her most treasured possessions, a tiny, exquisite painting.
What the Queen showed the young man was a miniature, a small, precious portrait meant for her eyes only. Discreet, private, even intimate. Like so much in the Elizabethan Renaissance, this was an art that looked inwards. The art of a people obsessed with secrets. This was an age when poets wrote in codes, when artists filled paintings with mysterious symbols. And even buildings spoke in riddles. In this series, I argue that Britain had a Renaissance as exciting as anything in Europe. A Renaissance with its own style, sometimes eccentric, often dazzling, and peculiarly British. And in the Elizabethan age, we discovered a new sense of who we were and our place in the world. The year 1564, the year the ambassador called on the Queen, was a special year in the history of the Renaissance.
It was the year that Michelangelo, the last great figure of the Florentine Renaissance, died. And it was also the year that William Shakespeare, the greatest figure of the British Renaissance, was born. Now, it was a coincidence, of course, but it was a revealing coincidence. And for me, it symbolises a baton being passed, the moment when the British finally acquired the confidence to take the Renaissance their own way.
In 1564, the country was at a crossroads. Isolated in Catholic Europe, Protestant England cut its ties with the continent and turned in on itself. And it was not long before a distinctive native art form emerged. In that year, a dashing young man was working as an apprentice in London. His name was Nicholas Hilliard. He would become the first great British painter, although he didn't start out as one.
Nicholas Hilliard was from a family of goldsmiths. His grandfather was a goldsmith, his father was a goldsmith, his uncle was a goldsmith, two of his brothers were goldsmiths. He married the daughter of a goldsmith, and not wanting to rock the boat, Hilliard also became a goldsmith.
Hilliard was apprenticed to the Queen's personal jeweller, and when he began to paint miniatures, he brought the painstaking precision of the goldsmith to his work. He set up a small studio in the city, and before long, the capital's guildsmen, lawyers, and aristocrats were clamouring to have him paint their portraits. For Hilliard's intricate work was head and shoulders above the competition, and unlike anything seen on the continent.
He was very skillful, very talented. He was the first portrait miniaturist to really create jewels on the painted surface. No miniaturist has done that before him.
So, Alan, do you want to show us what you've got in your box?
Okay.
Alan Derbyshire at London's Victoria and Albert Museum knows Hilliard's techniques like the back of his own hand.
So this is a portrait miniature by Nicholas Hilliard.
She's smiling at us.
Unknown woman, we don't know who the sitter is.
Right.
And we can place it under the microscope and have a look at the techniques that Hilliard used.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Oh, this is exciting. Oh, and it's coming up there.
Yep. I think one of the key things Hilliard did when he was painting these miniatures, he has almost a three-dimensionality to them.
Right.
You can imagine in the 16th century when someone picked up a miniature, they would have held it in the hand and turned it with candlelight or light coming from a window or something, and they get a real sense of the structure and the texture of the miniature.
Yes.
What Alan finds most striking about Hilliard's pictures are the exquisite painted jewels.
This is the earring, and that's a pearl, a drop pearl. And you can see this has been created using lead white, and the black dot would actually have been a silver highlight.
He must have had incredible eyesight, an incredibly steady hand as well.
I think so. I mean, sometimes I wonder whether some of those touches were placed using magnification of some kind. And here we've got what remains of a ruby.
So do you think you've figured out how he painted his rubies?
We think we've got a good idea, yeah. The first thing he would have done is take some silver paint.
Why would your foundation be silver?
So it's going to act as a reflector.
Right. So it gets the light shimmering through
Exactly.
the jewel.
Yeah. And then we're going to burnish it using a burnisher made from a little animal tooth. So now we need to take the body of the ruby. Now that's made by mixing turpentine resin with the pigments.
Silly me thought that Hilliard's miniatures were painted with paintbrushes. He's got a needle as well.
Yep.
So you're just dropping it on top of the silver.
Yeah. And what you might see as well, you're getting a little tail of the varnish. So that's gone back into a nice globular shape now.
So can we take a look at your handiwork under the microscope?
It's not going to be as good as Hilliard's, but we can have a look.
That is incredibly impressive, actually.
It's not bad.
And Hilliard was clearly a very clever man.
Hilliard's miniatures were not intended for public display. They were private gifts, exchanged between lovers, held close to the heart. And Hilliard filled them with a secret symbolism that the Elizabethans adored.
Now this is one of Hilliard's most perplexing images. It shows a man, a very elegant young man, clutching an anonymous hand from the clouds. Now, we don't know who he is, although virtually every man in Elizabethan England has been a candidate, including actually the young William Shakespeare. But we're pretty certain about its meaning, that this miniature is a gesture of devotion. There is a Latin inscription on it, and it reads, Attici amoris ergo, eloquent because of love. Now, it's probably some kind of in-joke. It's probably this man saying to the owner of that hand, I'm crazy about you, and I can't stop talking about it.
But Hilliard's most recognisable miniature is surely this one, a young man amongst roses, painted in 1587.
Now, I'm going to make a confession. If I could steal any artwork from any art gallery, it would probably be this one. And like so many of these miniatures, it is a declaration of love. This man is clutching his heart. Now, we don't know for certain who he is, but we're pretty sure who he's in love with. You just have to follow the clues. So he is surrounded by white roses, and white roses were the flowers of the Queen. And he is wearing black and white clothes, a rather fetching black fur jacket and some white tights. And black and white were the colours of the Queen. So this man is in love with Queen Elizabeth. But there's a problem. He is clearly in his early 20s, and when this picture was painted, Elizabeth was not only in her 50s, but Virgin Queen, famously unavailable. And that's why at the top there is a motto in Latin that reads, "My praised faith brings suffering." In short, he's lovesick.
Hilliard's little miniatures are a world away from the extravagant frescoes and vast statues of the Italian Renaissance. Intimate, private, coded, they have a distinctly British discretion. But not everyone wanted to be discreet. The Elizabethans didn't just want coded portraits in their pockets. Increasingly, they wanted them on their walls.
Elizabethan portraits have always had a bad press. Again and again, they've been compared to work by the great Italian masters, and again, they've been found wanting. They've repeatedly been branded provincial, primitive, and second-rate. Yet I think they were, in their own way, masterpieces of the Renaissance. We just need to look at them differently.
These were pictures for Britain's newly rich. And neither artists nor subjects cared if they looked lifelike. Take the Chumley sisters. They look like they've just been assembled from a flat pack. But for the artist, it was pattern, not personality, that counted. The Elizabethans also crammed their portraits with Latin inscriptions and arcane symbols. The results were often very odd. This picture celebrates the marriage of two devout Christians, complete with special guest. But above all, Elizabethan portraits told stories. The stories of their Renaissance sitters.
Now, I want to ask you about this one. This is one of the most unusual Elizabethan paintings that survives.
Yeah, this is a portrait of Henry Unton, who is an ambassador and a soldier under Elizabeth I's reign. And
with a very big head,
huge great head. But I think what's lovely about this picture is that it's commissioned by his wife after his death. It's a visual obituary, if you like, of Unton's life. And so it starts off right down here, and he's been born here, and this is his mother. And then you next see him when he goes up to Oxford, and there he appears again.
Is this him sitting in the window doing his studies?
And he's at Oriel College in Oxford in the 1570s. And then he goes to Venice, across the Alps, but later on in the 1580s he fights in the Low Countries, and there is an encampment and a battle fighting with the Earl of Leicester. And then he becomes ambassador to France, and you see France here.
So this top bit, this is like his CV.
It is, absolutely. This is all the kind of wonderful public work that he's done in the service of the Crown. And what you see in this little room here is this tragic scene of Unton's death, and he is in his deathbed, and this is the hearse and the horses, which are draped in black, as you can see here. And then it's coming into the house, and then you have the funeral procession along here and
all these
right to the
remarkably
church.
haunting figures in black. This isn't just a painted portrait, it's a painted biography, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's why when people criticise Elizabethan portraits and they say, well, they're not creating great likenesses, this is a different kind of likeness,
Yeah.
but it's an extraordinary likeness because we've got this whole life
Yeah.
told in the space of just one panel.
And it's absolutely charming. When would you get this much detail, visual detail about someone's life? You often hear through letters and things what people did. But actually seeing this is absolutely extraordinary because it captures a real flavour of the Elizabethan period.
But for me, the most intriguing of all Elizabethan portraits is virtually unknown. For years, this beguiling Renaissance image has been locked away in the stores of the Northampton Art Gallery.
So this is a portrait of one of Queen Elizabeth's favourite courtiers, Sir Christopher Hatton. But it's very much more than a portrait, because Hatton, with his marvellous moustache, of which I'm very jealous, is surrounded by a complex array of figures, inscriptions and emblems. So up here on the right, that is a coat of arms. And it has, if you look closely, the Golden Hind. That's where Francis Drake got the name for his famous ship. And down here, we have an artist painting a painting of Hatton. So there's a kind of picture within a picture here. So at first sight, this painting seems to be a kind of great big British Renaissance status symbol. But it's more than that, because this painting isn't just a portrait of Hatton's present, it's also a portrait of his future. Surrounding Hatton are personifications of the 7 planets, and outside them, the 12 signs of the zodiac. So this is essentially Hatton's horoscope. And his destiny is very promising indeed, because underneath here, an inscription, the speech bubble, if you like, reads, "Destined for eternity." But don't be fooled by the optimism, because this great confident image of a Renaissance man is completely overturned when you look at the other side. So here on the back is a figure of Father Time, Tempus. And underneath him are the 3 ages of life. On the left, youth is represented by a dancing couple. Now, Hatton was a famously good dancer, perhaps the best dancer in England. Middle age is represented by a woman unrolling the thread of life. And on the right, death is represented by an urn. But even more astonishing is this inscription down here, because at the very end of that inscription, the painting reveals its true purpose. Hoc me vestibulo posuit debuit hoc pigros solicitae viros. I was put in this room as a lesson to rouse lazy men. And this painting would probably have hung in the entrance hall of Hatton's house, and it would have greeted his visitors with the message, "Come on, guys, seize the day. You haven't got long before you die."
Hatton's portrait proves that British Renaissance painting was far from primitive and backwards. It was rich and clever and sophisticated. Art for an urbane and educated society. But the Elizabethans loved complexity in all art forms. They were obsessed with double meanings, treble meanings, and they revelled in riddles, puzzles, and wordplay. Cleverness permeated absolutely everything they did.
So this is a poem by the celebrated Elizabethan writer Sir John Davies, and it essentially describes the British Renaissance itself as a golden age that is healing all the world's problems. So who is responsible for this golden age? Who is responsible for this Renaissance? Well, there is a code in this poem that provides us with the answer. All you have to do is look at the first letters of every single sentence, and they spell Elizabetha Regina, Queen Elizabeth.
Davies's code was not just a display of intelligence, It was a pledge of allegiance. But Elizabeth's golden age had a darker side. Clever codes began to be used to conceal things from the Queen and her agents. And one Elizabethan rebel turned disguise into an art form.
Thomas Tresham was rich, well-educated and well-connected. He was undoubtedly one of the cleverest men in England, and he could easily have been one of its most powerful. But there was a catch. Tresham was also a devout and unwavering Catholic, and he paid the price for it.
With Catholic Spain threatening to invade Protestant England, English Catholics became potential enemies of the state. For most of his adult life, Tresham lived under surveillance, and he spent the best part of 20 years in prison. Yet Thomas Tresham's will could not be broken.
Now, in the many years he spent locked up in prison, away from his home, away from his family, Thomas Tresham was busy planning, drawing, plotting an audacious and dangerous act of defiance. It was an act that, in my opinion, would result in some of the most fascinating and perplexing architecture of the entire Renaissance.
When Tresham returned home from prison in 1593, he started to build this lodge for his rabbit warrener in a secret corner of his estate in Northamptonshire. But it wasn't really a lodge for his rabbit warrener. It was a stunningly elaborate architectural code that spelled out his Catholic defiance.
Now, there's one instantly recognizable thing about this building. It's obsessed with the number 3. So it's triangular, so it has 3 sides, and each of these sides, each of these walls, is 33 feet long. There are 3 sets of windows, and each of these windows is constructed out of the 3-sided triangle and the 3-parted trefoil. There are 3 stories, and on top of those stories, there is a roof that's constructed of 3 gables, each of which has 3 sides. And in case all of that escaped you, here above the door is the Latin phrase tres testimonium dant, and that means the number 3 bears witness. Now, why this obsession with the number 3? Well, it could be just a play on words. Tresham's nickname was Tres, but I think it's more than that, because 3 is also the number of the Holy Trinity.
God himself was threefold: Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But this wasn't just a Christian Trinity, it was a Catholic Trinity. Throughout the building are coded references to Catholic beliefs and rituals. The letters beneath the angels are a secret code for Catholic prayers. And the chimney is filled with symbols of the forbidden Catholic Mass.
Now, Tresham wrote his Catholic faith deep into the fabric of this building, and it really is one of the most cryptic structures in Britain. It is filled with secrets, with riddles, with codes, many of which are yet to be deciphered. But for Tresham, this was only the beginning.
After yet another spell in prison, Tresham embarked on an even more ambitious building project in Northamptonshire, a retreat for himself and his family. It may well be my favourite building in the country. It is called Lyveden New Build.
Now, in many ways, the most remarkable thing about this building is that Tresham never finished it. In September 1605, construction work here ceased, and it never started again. So what we're actually looking at is essentially a building site, a Renaissance masterpiece that's been held in a kind of suspended animation for more than 400 years.
But despite its incomplete state, Lyveden is still packed with hidden religious meanings, many of which relate to the Passion of Christ.
So all around this ground floor frieze there are these emblems, and all of them refer to the Passion of Christ. So here we have the 30 silver pieces surrounding the money bag. That was the money that Judas was paid to betray Christ. There are the spears, the lantern. These were the things that were used to arrest Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's the garment that was taken by the Roman soldiers. And finally, there is the crucifix with the ladder, with the nails, with all those things that were used to kill Christ. So we have the whole story of the Passion told around the perimeter of this building.
Above the frieze are inscriptions in Latin that celebrate Christ's sacrifice. But this is only to scratch the surface. As with the triangular lodge before it, the meaning of this building is embedded within its structure.
Now, this building is made up of 5 equal squares, and that was for a reason. 5 was the number of wounds that Christ suffered. 2 in the hands, 2 in the feet, 1 in the abdomen. But Thomas Tresham took it further. Take a look at this bay window. There are 5 sides of this bay window, and each of these sides is 5 feet long. 5 times 5 is 25, and 25th was Christ's birthday.
And from the air, the meaning of Tresham's building is complete. Based on the form of a cross, its shape reminds the heavens that its owner is always thinking about the crucifixion. Lyveden New Build would have been one of the great Renaissance buildings in Europe. But Tresham's unlucky life came to an unfortunate end. On the 11th of September 1605, he died in terrible pain and in huge debt. And that is why he never finished his masterpiece.
Thomas Tresham had a miserable life, but for me, he embodies everything that's wonderful about the British Renaissance. Its cleverness, its quirkiness, its desire to hide rather than reveal, but perhaps above all, its stubborn but brilliant rebelliousness.
Tresham was one of the most ingenious men in Britain, but he was not the most ingenious. That prize should surely go to a Welshman called John Dee, the man who would lead the country out of its isolation. Dee was what one might call a Renaissance man, mathematician, astrologer, scientist, secret agent, and he also liked to dabble in the supernatural.
John Dee is famous today for his magic, for his crystal ball, and for his apparent ability to communicate with angels. Now, I personally don't believe a word of all that, but Dee was a brilliant showman.
As a young man, Dee staged a production of a Greek play at Trinity College, Cambridge. His opening scene was unforgettable.
The seats were packed with students and academics, all waiting for the show to start. And by God, did it start. The lights revealed an actor climbing onto the back of a huge mechanical beetle. And if that wasn't enough, the beetle then took off and flew around the room.
The audience must have thought it was magic, but Dee had actually produced the illusion with mirrors, ropes, and pulleys. And Dee's ingenuity would not go unnoticed. He soon became an advisor to the Queen herself, and on the 28th of November 1577 he brought her an astounding proposal. Today it's kept in the Bodleian Library in Oxford.
Now, Dee's proposal would be of momentous importance to British history. It would come to define our national ambitions as well as our identity for the best part of 400 years. And it would prove to be a turning point in the British Renaissance.
Dee outlined his proposal in a book. And the title page, which Dee himself designed, cloaked that proposal in yet another fiendish Renaissance code.
And this is it. And of course, it's deliberately confusing, probably because Dee didn't want the Queen's enemies to decipher its contents. So there is a phrase that translates as, "More is concealed than revealed," and that may well be a defining characteristic of the British Renaissance. So, what does it show? Well, here is Queen Elizabeth with her courtiers, and above her is the moon with a slightly funny face, 10 stars, the sun, and to the right, this thing called the Hebrew tetragrammaton, which was the sacred four-letter word of God. And you can see here that it is filling her sails with wind. And underneath, this is probably the New World, the Americas. There is a woman here on her knees with an inscription in Greek that says, "Send forth an expedition." And above her is this semi-naked woman, a figure of opportunity, beckoning Elizabeth on. And there are all these other symbols that hundreds of years later we still haven't yet deciphered, like this piece of wheat that's upside down and this skull that's half out of the image. So what is John Dee saying? Well, I think he's telling Elizabeth to build a navy, to send that navy around the world, to challenge the French and the Spanish, to lay claim to the New World, to bring Protestantism to the uncivilized, to form colonies. John Dee is telling her to create a British Empire.
Dee was in fact the very first to use the phrase British Empire. His idea would be a turning point in British history and a turning point in the British Renaissance. Dee's proposal unleashed a wave of exploration. This was the moment when Britain took the lead in the discovery of new worlds. The moment we stopped looking inwards and started looking out. In 1580, Francis Drake became the first Englishman to sail around the world. Other explorers voyaged to Africa, the Arctic, and the Americas. And their travels inspired a new generation of artists, scientists, and craftsmen. One of the finest was the mathematician and instrument maker Emery Molyneux, who had his workshops in South London.
Emery Molyneux had accompanied Francis Drake on some of his voyages around the world, so he really knew his stuff. And after his return, he secured funding to embark on a remarkable project. He did years of research. He met with navigators and explorers. He collaborated with mathematicians, cartographers, artists. And eventually, Emery Molyneux produced something no Englishman had ever produced before.
A globe. James Bissell Thomas is a globe maker who still uses the techniques that Molyneux pioneered.
We know he used papier-mâché. Flour makes a very good glue. So it's something that the Tudors would have had. And I know that Molyneux, on his smaller globes, which were used on ships, in order to avoid dampness of the humidity of the areas where they were, these flour globes he was making actually withstood that. We've got one here which is actually dry.
It's looking really good. I love this Shakespeare on the front.
There he is. The next stage is the joining of the globe and applying the plaster. Straight on, down to the
Just
right.
down here?
Yeah.
OK, let's go.
In fact, James, if you can hold that.
OK, I'll hold it. And it fits extremely well.
Right. Here we
So,
go.
the world is complete.
It is.
It is like playing God, isn't it?
You are the master of the universe at this moment, James.
Exactly. Just in the space of a minute, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, united.
Indeed. It's castable plaster, so it will dry quickly. It is a very easy way to make a good spherical globe. Now, once this is fully covered, if I can take that down a sec, you will then end up with a beautiful plaster sphere. Then, once it's dried, you then apply the gauze.
You stick each one on individually.
That's right. And due to the talent of the engraver, they all align beautifully.
So with Molyneux's globe, with this engraving, how long would the engraving have taken?
I think the engraving would have taken, yeah, a good year. And he was doing it with such limited technology at the time, and it is beautiful. The most important thing is that they've stood the test of time. They're still standing today.
In 1592, Emery Molyneux released the first printed English-made globes, and the largest the world had ever seen. I've come to Petworth House in Sussex to see the earliest surviving example. It's believed that this globe once belonged to Sir Walter Raleigh when he was imprisoned in the Tower of London.
This is the first British-made globe in history, and the thought that Walter Raleigh pored over this very object 400 years ago in the Tower of London is enough to send shivers up the spine. My very favourite thing about this globe is the fact that there's virtually no Britain left on it. And I think the reason for that was that Walter Raleigh's fingers, and many fingers after him, kept pointing at the bloody country saying, "That's Britain, that's where we are." But this isn't really a piece of cartography. What it really is a piece of propaganda. And I'll show you why. Round here, there are two little lines. A little blue line with the initials TC and a little red line with the initials SFD. TC was Thomas Cavendish, SFD, Sir Francis Drake. So these lines actually chart rather painstakingly the route that those two men made as they voyaged around the globe. So this globe is really a perfect opportunity for the British to show off. And right round here, there is a great big British coat of arms planted over North America. So this globe is a symbol of a newly confident nation. But it's more than that, because for me, this globe also reflects an entirely new Renaissance worldview, a new way of seeing the world. No longer a world as a mysterious, boundless place that's so much bigger than us, but a place that is finite, a place that one can own, a place that one can manipulate, and a place that can be traversed with a single finger.
But explorers weren't the only ones out exploring. Artists were globe-trotting as well, and one of them was John White. He may have had an ordinary name, but what he did was anything but.
Now, John White was given the commission of a lifetime, perhaps even the commission of a generation. He was asked to make drawings of all the unfamiliar, all the exotic plants, animals, and people that he encountered in the Americas. Now, the drawings that he made would be of momentous importance and momentous originality, but they would almost destroy him in the process.
In July 1587, White landed on the east coast of America to found the first British colony in the New World.
White wasn't alone. He brought 115 nervous settlers with him, and among them was his son-in-law and his 20-year-old daughter.
Now, it must have been an exhausting journey for them all, particularly for his daughter, who was heavily pregnant. But White was convinced this would be a fresh start for the family, a place to find wealth, to find comfort, and maybe even to find happiness.
A month after their arrival in Indian territory, White's daughter gave birth to a girl. They called her Virginia, the first English child to be born in the Americas. And John White's drawings of this new world caused a sensation in the Elizabethan court. Those drawings are held in the British Museum. They are not only the first British artworks of the New World, they may also be the first watercolours in British history. And they are breathtaking.
Now, there was nothing too small for John White to paint. Now, this is surely one of my favourites, this most delightful image of fireflies. And I love the way that John White has arranged them on the page, 3 of them just staring at each other. And in the middle, this inscription, which to me reads more like poetry than anything else. A fly which in the night seemeth a flame of fire. And here we have these exotic creatures that John White would have encountered. The loggerhead turtle, the pelican, and this unforgettable image of the flamingo. They are such sensitive portraits of these very unusual animals. But you shouldn't be too fooled by that, because pretty much the first thing John White did after he painted these animals was eat them. And flamingo was one of his favourites. He thought the tongues were delicious.
But White's most remarkable images are of the native people he met there, the Algonquin Indians.
Now, this is probably the most fascinating and certainly the most macabre. It depicts the Algonquin equivalent of a charnel house, and it is filled with all the dead bodies of chiefs. But it isn't quite what it looks, because these bodies have actually had their skin pulled off, the flesh taken out, sun-dried, and then put into these little boxes by their feet. Then the skeletons were covered with leather and the skin pulled back on. And what's remarkable about this is John White glimpsing something that no one from Europe had ever seen before, looking right into the most private, intimate parts of the Algonquin lifestyle. Now, this is a portrait of an Indian chief, and you can tell he's a chief because he is covered in symbols of his status. The body paint, the jewellery, the feathers, and perhaps best of all, the puma tail. And it's got so many lovely details. You can see that the man has shaved one side of his head so it doesn't get caught in his bow. It's an extremely unusual image, of course, but for me, this is a great Renaissance portrait. I mean, John White was painting an entirely alien culture, a culture that must have seemed unchristian, uncivilized, un-English, and yet here in these paintings, there is no judgment and there is no racism.
John White's little paintings may not look like Michelangelo's or Leonardo's, but they are just as much a result of the Renaissance. The product of a society looking afresh at the world, with sensitivity and, above all, with curiosity. But the story of John White would end in disaster. Famine forced him to abandon his family and return to England for supplies. It would be 2 frustrating years before he was finally able to get a ship to return. In 1590, he arrived at the colony, but he was horrified by what he found.
Nothing. That's what he found. The houses were gone. His possessions were scattered, and worst of all, the people were gone too. There was no sign of anybody. No settlers, no daughter, no granddaughter. All John White found were ruins. And on a tree, a mysterious inscription. The 3 letters C-R-O. Now, people have been trying to decipher that enigmatic code ever since, but they haven't yet succeeded. And John White certainly didn't.
John White never found his family. His colony, the very first in the Americas, had vanished. To this day, we have no idea what happened to it. The ship on which John White first sailed to America should be as famous as Charles Darwin's Beagle. For travelling with White was another genius of a different sort, a young scientist called Thomas Harriot. Today, Harriot is almost forgotten, but he should be remembered as one of the greatest minds of the entire Renaissance.
Thomas Harriot's CV is utterly mind-boggling. He was the country's leading navigator. He was a brilliant mathematician who pioneered new forms of algebra. He was the first man to truly understand the science of rainbows, and he may well have been the first recorded person in history to die as a result of tobacco.
As John White was drawing the Algonquin Indians, Thomas Harriot was actually speaking to them. The first Briton to learn a native American language. But this was a language without writing, and so Harriot devised a pioneering alphabet of his own.
Now, Harriot's alphabet consisted of 36 characters. That's 10 more than our current alphabet, and that is because Harriot's alphabet was a phonetic alphabet, each character denoting a sound. So, this one over here, this is an sound. The next one, this is an A sound as in name. And I must say, it does look like an A and an E squashed together. And this one over here, this is a th. This is like a hard th, as in thy or the. And Harriot in his papers experimented with lots of different sentences constructed out of these characters. And one of his most evocative sentences is this one. This sentence translates as, if I can do it, Our Father, which art in, you can guess the final word, heaven. And this word here is which. And he has produced the beginning, and it's a very complicated sound to produce, the beginning of the word which. He begins it with an H. This is an H sound, and this is a W sound. And that's because Harriot pronounced the word which. So this is Our Father, which art in heaven.
Harriot was nothing if not ambitious for his new creation. He dreamed it would become a universal alphabet, one for the whole world. In a sense, it was yet another Elizabethan code. But this one wasn't being used to conceal, but to communicate. The perfect symbol of a new, expansionist British Renaissance. Harriot was a shy, retiring figure and never published his alphabet. In fact, he published hardly anything, not even what was surely his greatest discovery. And Harriot's first step towards that discovery was taken on the 17th of September, 1607. That night, Harriot, like the rest of Renaissance Europe, saw Halley's Comet soaring through the night sky.
Now, Thomas Harriot was completely inspired by what he saw, and he became convinced that the real New World was not across the oceans, but beyond the skies. And to this end, he somehow managed to obtain the most cutting-edge contraption in Renaissance Europe, the telescope.
On the night of the 26th of July, 1609, he did something utterly unprecedented.
It was about 9 o'clock when the clouds finally cleared. This was the British Renaissance, after all, and Harriot got out his telescope, pointed it at the sky, and looked through it at the moon. And then he did something no human being had ever done before.
Harriot began to sketch what he could see through the telescope. And astonishingly, Harriot's revolutionary little drawing still survives.
And this is it. Harriot's first drawing, the first time anyone had drawn the moon through a telescope. This is nearly 4 months before Galileo even did it. And Harriot has been very precise about the labelling. Top left, the 26th of July, 1609, 9 p.m. That's exactly when he made this drawing. Top right, 5 days. That's how old the moon was when he drew it. And down here, 6:1, that's the magnification. Harriot's telescope was very primitive. He could only make the moon 6 times larger than it actually was. And that probably explains why, quite frankly, it looks a bit more like an overused tennis ball than a celestial body. But my favourite is probably this one over here, because underneath this delicious drawing of the moon is an apology. He writes down here, "I could not get done the figure of all because I was troubled with the rheum." Basically, he had a cold, and no wonder he was up on the roof all night.
Harriot, however, tinkered with his telescope, and his moon drawings became better and better and better.
This is surely Harriot's masterpiece. And it was done with a 30 times magnification, so he'd increased the power of his hardware by 5-fold. It's a staggeringly detailed map. It's a map that holds up even today. So you've got here the Ocean of Storms, the largest sea on the moon, 1,600 miles across. And right in this spot, that there is right at the very edge of the Sea of Tranquility. And that is exactly where Neil Armstrong and the crew of Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969. Now, these drawings may not be masterful works of art, but they do remind me of Leonardo's infinitely more famous drawings, because they are about looking at the world in a fresh way, and about using 2 eyes, 1 pen, and a piece of paper to do it. And surely, if the Renaissance is about anything, this is it.
By 1610, the country had undergone a cultural revolution. Only a few generations earlier, it had been isolated and inward-looking. Now, however, its horizons had expanded, beyond its own shores, beyond Europe, even beyond the Earth.
It was from that surge of exploration, ingenuity, and creativity that a remarkable, well, unique figure emerged. He was surely the greatest figure of the British Renaissance. He was probably the greatest figure of the European Renaissance, and he may well be one of the great figures in the history of Western culture. You know his name.
But William Shakespeare was not the isolated genius we often imagine. He was a man alive to the upheavals and discoveries of his time. In 1610, as Thomas Harriot was mapping the moon, William Shakespeare began work on his last great play. It was a tale of magic, wonder, and anxiety, and it perfectly captured the spirit of the age.
The Tempest begins like a Hollywood action movie. A ferocious storm engulfs a small ship at sea, and amid the thunder, amid the lightning, amid the wailing wind, a terrified crew does all it can to stay alive. But this is no normal storm. This has been conjured by a magician called Prospero. Now, I'm convinced that Shakespeare's inspiration for Prospero was none other than John Dee.
He was, after all, the real magus of Renaissance Britain, the man who could make beetles fly, the man who could commune with angels, and the man who inspired countless ships to sail these seas in search of colonies. In fact, Prospero's storm is designed to lure the ship's crew to his own private colony, an island where he has enslaved the only creature on it. Shakespeare knew about Britain's colonisation of the New World. He must have read Thomas Harriot's account of his voyage to Virginia. He must have seen John White's watercolours of the Algonquin Indians. And he must have heard all those rumours about storms and shipwrecks and vanished sailors around the seas. Shakespeare famously pillaged the facts, the fictions, the tall tales, the anecdotes and the gossip of this dramatic era. To my mind, it's impossible not to see The Tempest as a kind of mirror, however obscured or refracted, of Renaissance England itself. For like his fictional crew, this tiny little island, which had once been so insular, was now hurtling into uncharted territory. Shakespeare was asking and answering the great questions of Renaissance Britain. In a phrase from the play itself, what would this brave new world be like? In the 50 years between 1564 and 1611, something extraordinary happened in Britain. Its artists, writers, architects and scientists embarked on their own voyages of discovery, and they took the Renaissance their own way. In doing so, they produced a Renaissance that was wayward, eccentric, often maddeningly complex, but one that was as brilliant as anything in Europe. All voyages, however, come to an end. Even the glorious voyage of Elizabethan Britain. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Next time, the British Renaissance enters its final phase. As Britain opens its doors to Europe again, a battle begins. A battle for the heart and soul of British culture.